get you this conversation now. The Kingdom of Lesotho is closely monitoring and restricting the movement of livestock, particularly in areas bordering South Africa. This is due to the high risk of cross-border transmission, while previously holding a clean status. Recent reports highlight the urgent need for vigilance and vaccination strategies to avoid infection following the widespread of foot-and-mouth disease in South Africa since the year 2019. This outbreak is already devastating the local lucrative wool and mohair industry and disrupting the red meat value chain. Here's Lesotho entrepreneur Stephen Monyamane, who has been adversely impacted by the cross-border livestock restrictions. Mr. Monyamane, thank you so much for your time on the program. I guess it's a devastating time for all farmers at this point. And how has foot and mouth disease affected the small-scale farmers and entrepreneurs in Lesotho?
Thank you very much for that. First of all, let me start and say, if you look at the entire red meat value chain and the trade across has been adversely affected. But we also need to understand that Lesotho as a sovereign country has the responsibility to protect its citizens and to also protect the livelihood of its business. And the validity behind the closing of the borders, you have our wool and mohair, which is one of our largest contributors to our GDP, among the top 10. As a result, anything that could affect that, because all our wool and mohair is for export, has to be considered. That being said, we are also part of the global veterinary services. Nonetheless, because of our geographic location within South Africa, there has to be some different arrangements made, because changing over a practice of over 100 plus years of whereby even to this day there are still cattle crossing the border, grazing on the other side, coming back at night, that exists. Now, talking about the meat traders, this is where the risk is. I'm a meat trader. On average, I import between 15 to 20 tons per fortnight of meat from South Africa into Lesotho. Now, there are standard operating procedures to do that. I would normally get an export permit from the Ministry of Livestock in Lesotho, which I know I will buy from a cleared abattoir in South Africa. And before my goods leave the abattoir, there'll be a state vet who will do a health attestation and then seal the container or the truck, refrigerated truck, which will only be unsealed when it gets to Lesotho. So within reason, you've followed all the necessary health, food safety controls and protocols, right? But today, because there's that restriction, a lot of us, because we do not have an approved abattoir in Lesotho, are forced to slaughter cattle in the backyard. So, which is now risking the food safety measure that we want to protect in the first place. So we need to then align and say, yes, we are following global conventions of veterinary services, but what risk are we imposing on the livelihoods of consumers on a daily basis by completely blocking? And now that the President of South Africa on Friday announced this national state of emergency for foot and mouth, I believe the Lesotho government, a lot of the South African government, have to have a bilateral agreement of how do we handle this by virtue of our geographic location.
And I know that, there has been so many efforts around this, and since the outbreak in particular, talk to us about some of the engagements that the network has had with some of its stakeholders around this, as well as propositions in terms of how would we be able to navigate this, especially when we have to safeguard, that balance between lives and livelihoods.
So I think for starters, the first thing that will happen is it's hard lockdown, which is what happened, because we're saying, hey, there's an FMD risk. What is the value of our wool and mohair? So then immediately you go red protect. That's the first stage, which happened about 3 months ago. The next thing that has to happen is then saying, okay, we have protected this industry, but what can we then do to ease down? To then say, what measures can we put to that and say, let's do a risk assessment and say, how many of the abattoirs are cleared? Because there are certainly enough abattoirs in South Africa that are cleared. Thirdly, how do we then become preventative in our action versus to just literally go worst case scenario, lockdown? And there's been constant monitoring between the state vets in Lesotho and the state vets in South Africa to then understand what provinces are on the red, which ones are moving, and so on and so forth. So there's, on a weekly basis, there's communication among the state vets of the two countries. However, what I believe would work for the industry as a whole is to then say, just because there's foot and mouth in, let's say, Eastern Cape, it is not restricted movement between Gauteng province and the Free State province. And yes, Lesotho is a sovereign country and has its own rules, but because of our geographic location, we need to find a balance so that we can protect livelihoods. Because the worst case scenario, which is what is happening now, we are then importing meat from Botswana and Namibia. And I'll give an example. If an A-grade meat in South Africa today, as we speak, is 87 rands per kg, in Lesotho, the consumers are paying 161 rands per kg of red meat. So it's almost double. So the cost of it is extremely high. And trust me, that has also opened up a massive window for smuggling. And if there is smuggling, chances are there are improper controls, and we don't know if the meat that we are now getting is from at least approved abattoirs.
And, you touched on a bit earlier on about, some of the preventative measures that have been brought about. Authorities say restrictions are also kind of necessary to ensure that we prevent somewhat of a greater outbreak as well, Monyamane. Just from the ground, do you feel that the government is, of course, striking the right balance between, disease control and economic survival? Because that's where all of these conversations are now steering towards too.
I think economic survival is secondary, if it's there at all. The first one was actually restriction, which has been where we are, and there's never really been a proper plan of economic survival and not completely disrupting the entire value chain, and how do we still access the market, and now bringing in new measures of saying, how do we now control the trade in such a manner that one, it's not too expensive for Lesotho, because we do not have a fully functional value chain within the countries of Lesotho. So we do depend a lot on South Africa in terms of getting graded and approved with either FSSC 22000 or any other food safety standard meat. We still depend on South Africa for that one. So I believe striking a balance on the economic side has never really been done.
Yeah, and just, given the interconnectedness of livestock as well as movement across the borders, just, what kind of cooperation do you believe is needed between Lesotho and South Africa to manage this crisis effectively so?
So for starters, there is already standard operating procedures of what is required to be able to cross livestock from South Africa to Lesotho, right? Maybe we can then say, for now, live animals, because they could contact the disease along the way. Something could happen in as much as they would have been quarantined for 3 months, or your FMD test would have been tested with the SANA's lab in Pretoria. We can say maybe livestock, we put a complete hold on it. However, processed meat, because before any farmer loads the animal onto the trailer, they need to get a loading permit that comes from a state vet in that local area. And those vets would have tested all the necessary disease. By the time it gets to the abattoir, you do have meat inspectors who would inspect the live animal to ensure that it's disease-free. And upon slaughtering and the completion of it, you do then have, again, the state vet who will then come and seal the truck. So there are so many layers in the standard operating procedure to then say we have ensured within reason that the food or the meat is safe. So by simply making sure that we follow the existing protocols and ensure that we also on the Lesotho side say, okay, no truck will cross without health attestation from South Africa, which has to happen. And then the meat inspectors at the border of Lesotho Port Health, they're able to follow that to the letter. I think it still allow trade to happen, but restricting all the other diseases that could be there.
Lesotho entrepreneur Stephen Monyamane, thank you so much for your time on the program today.